The moon hung low over the kingdom of Valdros, casting silver light across the mountain peaks and the sprawling city below. From the highest balcony of the obsidian castle, a solitary figure stood motionless against the cold wind, his shadow stretching long across the ancient stone. Kael Valdros, king of the Lycan realm, watched his kingdom sleep. 15 years. 15 years since the crown had been placed upon his head. 15 years since he had knelt beside his father's deathbed and sworn to protect these lands, these people, this legacy built through centuries of blood and sacrifice. The kingdom prospered, the borders held strong, enemy nations spoke his name in whispered fear, and allied lords bowed their heads in genuine respect. By every measure that mattered, Kael Valdros was a successful king. Yet standing here in the darkness, with only the wind and the distant howls of his people to keep him company, he felt nothing but a vast, consuming loneliness that had become his constant companion. He gripped the stone railing, his knuckles whitening. The cold did not bother him. His Lycan blood ran hot enough to ward off any chill. But there was a different kind of cold inside him now, one that no fire could touch, no victory could warm. It had started 3 months ago, this strange ache in his chest. At first, he had dismissed it as fatigue. The burdens of rulership weighed heavy after all. But the feeling had grown, day by day, night by night, until it became a constant presence, a space where something vital should have been. His beast stirred restlessly beneath his skin, pacing like a caged predator. It sensed what his rational mind refused to acknowledge. Something was missing, something fundamental, and no amount of royal duty or military conquest could fill that space. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from behind. Kael did not turn. He knew those footfalls as well as he knew his own heartbeat. General Theron Blackwood emerged onto the balcony, his graying hair pulled back from a face carved by decades of warfare. At 55 years old, Theron had served 3 generations of Valdros kings. He had taught Kael to hold a sword before the boy could properly run. He had stood beside him in the bloodiest battles of the border wars, and he was perhaps the only man in the kingdom who could approach the king uninvited and live to tell of it. Theron stopped a respectful distance away, his keen eyes studying his king's rigid posture. He had noticed the change in Kael these past months, the restlessness during council meetings, the way his gaze would drift to some distant point that no one else could see, the subtle tension in his jaw that never quite relaxed. "The northern scouts have returned," Theron said, his voice a low rumble that matched the distant thunder. "King Fenris has moved another battalion to the border, nothing overtly aggressive, but the positioning suggests he is testing our response time." Kael remained silent for a long moment. The northern realm had been a thorn in Valdros' side for generations. King Fenris was young, ambitious, and hungry for the kind of glory that could only be won through conquest. The peace treaty signed by their fathers grew more fragile with each passing season. "Double the patrols along the Grey Mist Pass," Kael finally replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And send word to Lord Ashford. I want his cavalry units ready to mobilize within 3 days' notice." Theron nodded, but he did not leave. Instead, he moved to stand beside his king at the railing, looking out over the moonlit landscape. For several minutes, neither man spoke. They had shared enough silences over the years to be comfortable with the quiet. "You have not slept," Theron observed. It was not a question. A king's work is never finished. A king who does not rest becomes a liability to his kingdom. Kael's jaw tightened. Anyone else would have been dismissed for such words. But Theron had earned the right to speak plainly. He had carried a teenage Kael off a battlefield when the young prince had been too stubborn to retreat from overwhelming odds. He had stood as a pillar of strength during the dark days after the queen's death, when the kingdom threatened to tear itself apart. "Something troubles you," Theron continued. "I have known you since you were a pup stumbling over your own feet. I can see when the weight grows too heavy." Kael turned his gaze to the old warrior. In the moonlight, Theron's scars stood out in sharp relief, a map of battles fought and won, of loyalty proven through sacrifice. This man had given his entire life to the Valdros dynasty. He deserved honesty. "There is something wrong with me, Theron." The admission came harder than any wound Kael had ever suffered. "For 3 months now, I have felt as though a part of me is missing, a restlessness that nothing can quiet. My beast grows more agitated each day. I find no peace in my duties, no satisfaction in my victories. It is as if I am waiting for something that refuses to arrive." Theron was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Your father spoke of something similar once, in the months before he met your mother." Kael stiffened. His mother, Seraphina. The name still carried the power to cut through his defenses like a blade through silk. He rarely allowed himself to think of her. The memories were too sharp, too dangerous. "That is different," Kael said firmly. "My father's situation was unique." "Was it?" Theron's eyes held a knowing gleam. "The fated bond calls to those it has chosen, my king. It cares nothing for our plans or our resistance. It simply is." Kael pushed away from the railing, turning to face the old general directly. His golden eyes blazed with an intensity that would have sent lesser men scrambling for the door. "I have spent my entire reign ensuring that Valdros would never again be weakened by such matters. The fated bond destroyed my father, it consumed my mother. I will not follow that path." Theron held his ground, meeting his king's gaze without flinching. "With respect, my king, you may not have a choice. The moon goddess writes her own destiny." The words hung in this cold air between them. Kael wanted to argue, to dismiss the notion as superstition and sentiment. But deep inside, in the place where his beast resided, he felt the truth of it resonating like a struck bell. He turned away, unable to face Theron's knowing expression. "Leave me." Theron bowed slightly, recognizing the dismissal. But before he departed, he paused at the balcony entrance. "Whatever you are feeling, whatever you are fighting, you do not have to face it alone. You have loyal men who would follow you into the depths of shadow itself. Remember that." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the darkness of the castle. Kael remained on the balcony until the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. The strange ache in his chest had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, pulsing with an urgency that defied explanation. Tomorrow would bring another day of councils and correspondence, of military reports and political maneuvering. The endless machinery of kingship would demand his attention, and he would give it willingly. He had built his entire identity around duty, around sacrifice, around the unwavering commitment to his people and his crown. But tonight, in the quiet darkness before the dawn, Kael Valdros allowed himself to feel the full weight of his solitude. And somewhere in the depths of his ancient blood, his beast howled a mournful cry that no one else could hear. The morning brought no relief. Kael sat at the head of the great council table, surrounded by the lords and advisors who helped him govern the realm. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with tapestries depicting the great victories of Valdros history. Enormous windows allowed the morning light to stream in, illuminating the carved obsidian throne that dominated the far end of the room. Lord Marcus Greymane sat to Kael's right, his position denoting his status as the king's most trusted counselor. At 60 years old, Marcus had served Kael's father before him, offering wisdom and guidance through the most turbulent periods of the dynasty's history. His silver hair and lined face spoke of decades of service, but his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing. The other lords filled the remaining seats. Some were loyal allies, others were political necessities, and a few, Kael knew, would gladly see him fall if they believed they could profit from his failure. Such was the nature of power. "The harvest projections from the southern provinces are encouraging," Lord Ashford was saying, his voice droning on about bushels and quotas. "If the weather holds, we should see a surplus that will strengthen our reserves through the winter months." Kael nodded at the appropriate moments, offering brief acknowledgments that kept the meeting moving forward. But his attention was fractured, his focus constantly slipping toward the gnawing sensation that refused to be ignored. He had not slept. The night had passed in restless pacing, in futile attempts to quiet his beast, in memories that surfaced unbidden no matter how hard he tried to suppress them. His mother's face, Seraphina, beautiful and kind and utterly devoted to her fated mate. He remembered her laughter, the way it could fill a room with warmth. He remembered her gentle hands, how they would brush the hair from his forehead when he was a child struggling with nightmares. And he remembered finding her body. Kael closed his eyes briefly, forcing the image away. He had been 20 years old. Draven had been 17. They had found her in her chambers, peaceful as though she were merely sleeping. The healers had said it was her heart. A sudden failure, they claimed, the shock of losing her fated bond when the king had been gravely wounded in an assassination attempt. The official story was that Seraphina had died of grief, Unable to bear the potential loss of her bonded mate, her heart had simply given out. Kael had believed that story for 15 years. He had shaped his entire philosophy around it. The fated bond was a weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies. It had destroyed his mother. He would never allow it to destroy him. "Your Majesty?" Kael's eyes snapped open. Lord Marcus was watching him with concern barely concealed behind his formal expression. The other lords had fallen silent, their attention fixed on their king's unusual distraction. "Forgive me," Kael said smoothly, recovering instantly. "A king could never show weakness. The late hour has left me momentarily scattered. Please continue, Lord Ashford." The meeting resumed, but Kael could feel Marcus's gaze lingering on him. The old advisor knew him too well. He would have questions later, and Kael was not certain he had answers. The council session dragged on for another 2 hours, covering everything from trade agreements to boundary disputes to the ongoing tension with the Northern Realm. Kael participated when necessary, his responses sharp and decisive despite his internal turmoil. Whatever else might be wrong with him, he was still king. He would not fail his duty. When the lords finally departed, Marcus remained behind. He waited until the great doors had closed before rising and approaching the throne where Kael still sat. "Something is wrong." Marcus did not bother with diplomatic preambles. Their relationship had long since moved beyond such formalities. "You have not been yourself for months. Do not insult my intelligence by claiming otherwise." Kael met the old man's eyes. Marcus had been more than an advisor over the years. He had been a mentor, a father figure when Kael's own father had been consumed by grief and illness. He deserved the truth. "I do not know what is wrong," Kael admitted. "There is something inside me that feels incomplete, a restlessness that grows stronger each day. My beast is agitated in ways I cannot explain. I feel as though I am searching for something, but I cannot name what it is." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered words. "I have seen this before. Once, many years ago. In your father, in the months before he met your mother." Kael's hands tightened on the arms of his throne. "Do not speak to me of the fated bond. I will not hear it." "Whether you hear it or not changes nothing, my king. The bond exists. It is as real as the blood in your veins and the beast that shares your soul. If the moon goddess has chosen a mate for you, no amount of resistance will change that destiny. My mother died because of that bond. My father was never the same after losing her. I watched this kingdom nearly tear itself apart because our king was too consumed by grief to rule effectively. I will not allow history to repeat itself." Marcus sighed heavily. "I understand your fear, but consider this. Your mother's death was not caused by the bond itself. She died because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. To blame the bond is to blame the sun for setting or the tide for rising. These forces simply are." Kael rose abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He paced to the great windows, looking out over the city that had been his responsibility since he was barely a man. "What would you have me do, Marcus? Abandon my duties? Chase after shadows and feelings like some lovesick youth? I would have you acknowledge what you are feeling. Denial will not make it disappear. If anything, fighting the bond only makes its pull stronger. Your father tried to resist it as well in the beginning. It nearly drove him mad." The words struck closer to home than Kael wanted to admit. The restlessness, the sleepless nights, the growing sense that he was being pulled towards something he could not see. Was this what his father had experienced? "There is research," Marcus continued carefully, "ancient texts that speak of the fated bond and its nature. I could examine them, see if there is any way to ease what you are feeling without requiring you to act upon it." Kael turned back to face him. "You would do this?" "I would do anything to serve my king. But I will tell you honestly, in all my readings, in all the histories and accounts I have studied, I have never found a way to break a fated bond. It can be denied, suppressed, ignored, but it cannot be destroyed, not without destroying yourself in the process." The words settled over Kael like a heavy shroud. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "Search the archives anyway," he said finally. "I need to know what I am facing." Marcus bowed. "It will be done, my king." After the advisor departed, Kael remained alone in the great chamber, surrounded by the symbols of his power and the echoes of his ancestors. The obsidian throne seemed colder than usual, the tapestries depicting ancient victories somehow distant and meaningless. He was Kael Valdros, king of the Lycan realm, master of the most powerful nation of their kind. He had faced armies and assassins, political intrigue and open warfare. He had never known fear. But now, standing in the silence of his throne room, he felt the first stirrings of something very close to terror. Not of enemies or battles, but of something far more dangerous. The possibility that he might not be able to control his own heart. 3 days passed. 3 days of meetings and reports, of maintaining the facade of a king in perfect command of himself and his realm. 3 days of Marcus searching through ancient texts while Kael fought to suppress the growing urgency that clawed at his insides. On the third night, the urgency became unbearable. The full moon rose over Valdros, massive and silver, casting its ancient light across the land. For any Lycan, the full moon was a time of power, of connection to the primal forces that shaped their kind. For Kael, it had always been a night of strength and clarity. Tonight it felt like being torn apart from the inside. His beast raged beneath his skin, demanding freedom with an intensity Kael had never experienced. The ache in his chest had transformed into a burning need, a compass pointing towards something he could not name but could not ignore. He needed to run, to hunt, to release the pressure building inside him before it shattered his carefully constructed control. Without conscious decision, Kael found himself descending through the castle, past guards who snapped to attention at his passage, through corridors he could navigate blindfolded. He emerged into the private courtyard reserved for the royal family, where ancient trees formed a canopy of shadow and moonlight. General Theron intercepted him at the gate to the forest beyond. "My king, you should not go alone. The woods at night hold dangers, even for one of your power." "I need this, Theron. I need to run." The old warrior studied his king's face, seeing the barely contained wildness in those golden eyes. After a moment, he stepped aside. "At least allow me to organize an escort, a small group to maintain a perimeter." "No." The word came out harder than Kael intended. "Tonight I need to be alone. The beast demands it." Theron's expression flickered with concern, but he knew better than to argue when his king used that tone. He bowed stiffly and stepped back, allowing Kael to pass. The moment Kael entered the forest, something shifted inside him. The oppressive weight of the crown seemed to lift, replaced by the pure, uncomplicated instincts of the hunt. He shed his formal clothing, leaving it in a neat pile beside a familiar oak, and then he let the change take him. The transformation was pain and ecstasy intertwined. Bones reshaped, muscles reformed, skin gave way to thick fur. In moments, the man was gone, replaced by a massive creature that stood on powerful hind legs, its tawny fur gleaming in the moonlight. The Lycan form was neither fully wolf nor fully man, but something far more ancient and powerful than either. Kael threw back his head and released a howl that echoed through the mountains, a sound of pure primal release. Then he ran. Trees blurred past as he moved through the forest with supernatural speed. His senses expanded, taking in every scent, every sound, every subtle shift in the wind. For these precious moments, he was not a king weighed down by responsibility. He was simply a beast, following instincts older than memory. He ran for miles, pushing his body to its limits, trying to outpace the need that drove him. But no matter how fast he moved, the pull remained. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent, like a rope tied around his soul being slowly reeled in by an invisible hand. And then, without warning, everything changed. A scent hit him like a physical blow, wildflowers and rain, earth and something indefinably sweet. It cut through the pine and moss of the forest like a blade through silk, overwhelming his senses with its intensity. Kael stumbled to a halt, his massive chest heaving. His beast surged to the surface, howling a single word that echoed through every fiber of his being. Mine. He had never felt anything like this. The ache that had plagued him for months suddenly had a direction, a source, a purpose. Every instinct he possessed pointed toward that scent like a compass toward true north. He tried to resist. He planted his feet and commanded his body to turn back, to retreat to the safety of his castle and his crown. But his beast would not be denied. Not tonight. Not with that scent filling his lungs and setting his blood on fire. Almost against his will, Kael found himself moving again. Not running now, but stalking, hunting, following the trail that wound through the trees toward some destination his rational mind did not want to acknowledge. The forest opened into a small clearing, bathed in silver moonlight. and there, in the center of that sacred space, he saw her. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair that caught the moonlight and skin that seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. She wore a simple dress that marked her as common-born, but there was nothing common about the way she moved. She was dancing, alone in the clearing, her bare feet tracing patterns in the grass, her face lifted to the moon with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. She was laughing. The sound was like silver bells, like the first rain after a long drought. It reached into Kael's chest and wrapped around his heart with chains he knew he would never be able to break. His beast howled again, the sound tearing from his throat before he could stop it. Mate, mine, finally found, complete. The young woman froze. Her laughter died. She turned toward the edge of the clearing, her eyes widening as she took in the massive Lycan form watching her from the shadows. For a single eternal moment, their gazes locked. Kael saw recognition flash in her eyes, not of him specifically, but of what he was, what he represented. She was Lycan too, he realized. The scent confirmed it. But something else as well. Something softer. She was an Omega, the rarest and most vulnerable of their kind. Fear replaced the joy in her expression. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on an exposed root. Before she could fall, before she could flee, Kael's beast made a decision that his human mind could not override. He moved. In the space between heartbeats, he crossed the clearing and caught her. His massive arms encircled her small form, preventing the fall, pressing her against his chest. The contact was electrifying. He felt the bond snap into place with almost audible force, a golden thread of connection weaving between their souls. She screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through his primal haze like ice water. She struggled against him, her small fists beating uselessly against his chest, her Omega nature making her physically incapable of harming an alpha of his power. The fear in her eyes was a mirror. In it, Kael saw himself as she must see him. A monster, a predator, a thing of nightmare emerging from the darkness to claim her against her will. The realization was a bucket of cold water thrown over the flames of his instinct. With effort that felt like lifting mountains, Kael released her. He stepped back, fighting for control over a beast that raged against the separation. She ran. Of course she ran. She fled into the forest with the desperation of prey escaping a predator, her scent trail marking her passage like a golden thread in the darkness. Kael stood in the moonlit clearing, his chest heaving, his beast howling its outrage at letting her escape. Every instinct demanded he pursue. Every fiber of his being screamed that he could not let her go. But he was not just a beast. He was a king, and a king must have control. With a roar of frustration that shook the trees around him, Kael forced himself to remain still. He counted his breaths. He recited the names of his ancestors. He clung to his humanity with everything he had. When he finally felt stable enough to move, he did not follow her trail. Instead, he turned and ran in the opposite direction, back toward his castle, his throne, his responsibilities, back toward the life he understood. But he knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like ice, that nothing would ever be the same. He had found his fated mate, and now he had to decide what to do about her. For 3 days, Kael tried to forget. He threw himself into his duties with renewed intensity, filling every waking moment with meetings and reports and military inspections. He barely slept, and when exhaustion forced him to close his eyes, he dreamed of wildflowers and rain, of laughter in the moonlight, of eyes that shifted from joy to terror in a single heartbeat. Marcus brought him the results of his research on the 4th morning. The old advisor's expression was grim. "There is no way to break a fated bond, my king. The ancient texts are unanimous on this point. The bond can be ignored, suppressed, denied, but it cannot be severed. It is written into the very fabric of our souls by the moon goddess herself." "What happens if it remains incomplete?" Kael asked. "If the bond is never consummated?" Marcus hesitated. The texts describe a gradual deterioration. The pull grows stronger over time, becoming an obsession that consumes all rational thought. Eventually, the one who resists will either succumb or lose themselves entirely. Madness, they called it, a fate worse than death. Kael absorbed this information in silence. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "There is something else," Marcus continued. "The girl you encountered. I have had discreet inquiries made. She is called Ilara, of the Thornwood Pack. a small, peaceful community in the eastern forests. She is an Omega with an unusual gift for healing. Her pack values her greatly. You have been thorough. I serve my king in all things. Kael rose and walked to the window, looking out over his kingdom. Somewhere out there, in the eastern forests, a young woman was going about her life. Did she feel the same pull he did? Was she lying awake at night, haunted by the memory of a monster in the moonlight? What would you have me do, Marcus? Kidnap her? Force her into a bond she clearly fears? I saw her face that night. She was terrified. I would never suggest such a thing, Marcus said carefully. But I would counsel you to consider all options before making a decision. The bond exists whether you acknowledge it or not. The only choice you have is how to proceed. Kael turned back to face his advisor. And if I choose to let her go? To never see her again? Marcus's expression was filled with something that might have been pity. Then you condemn yourself to the fate the texts describe: madness, deterioration, and eventually death. A king who cannot rule is no king at all. The words struck home with brutal efficiency. Kael had sacrificed everything for his kingdom: his youth, his freedom, his chance at a normal life. He had given himself entirely to the crown and asked nothing in return except the strength to bear its weight. Now he was being asked to sacrifice his principles as well, to pursue a woman who feared him, to claim a bond he had sworn to reject, and the alternative was losing everything anyway. "Leave me," he said quietly. "I need to think." Marcus bowed and departed, leaving Kael alone with the impossible choice before him. For hours he wrestled with himself. The king in him demanded practicality. The bond existed. It would destroy him if left unfulfilled. Therefore, it must be addressed. The man in him recoiled at the thought of forcing himself upon a woman who had run from him in terror. The beast simply wanted its mate. Consequences be damned. In the end, it was not logic or ethics that decided him. It was the memory of her laughter in the moonlight, the pure, uncomplicated joy she had radiated before she saw him. She had been happy, free, alive in a way that Kael had not felt in 15 years. He wanted that. Not just her, though the bond screamed for her presence. He wanted to understand what it felt like to laugh without restraint, to dance under the moon without caring who might see. He wanted to know if such happiness was possible for someone like him. The decision crystallized with terrible clarity. He would bring her here, not to force the bond, not to claim her against her will, but to give both of them the chance to understand what the moon goddess had written in their souls. If she could not accept him, if the bond brought nothing but pain, then he would let her go and accept whatever fate awaited him. But he had to try. After 15 years of duty and sacrifice, of loneliness and hollow victories, he had to know if there was something more. Kael summoned his most trusted guards, men who had served him for years, whose loyalty was beyond question. He gave them careful instructions. Find the Omega called Ilara. Bring her to the castle. Do not harm her. Do not frighten her more than necessary. And send word to her pack that she had perished in an accident. Clean, final, irrevocable. It was a monstrous thing to do. He knew this even as he gave the order. He was condemning an innocent woman to separation from everyone she loved, to imprisonment in a gilded cage from which there would be no escape. But the alternative was his own destruction, and if he fell, the kingdom fell with him. Draven was not ready to rule. The northern realm would smell weakness and strike. Thousands would die in the wars that followed. One woman's freedom against the stability of an entire nation. The calculus was brutal but clear. As his guards departed to carry out his orders, Kael returned to the window and stared out at the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. His beast stirred in response, anticipation building in his blood. She was coming, whether she wanted to or not, and when she arrived, everything would change. For better or worse, the king of Valdros had made his choice. 2 nights later, they brought her to him. Kael stood in the depths of the castle, in a chamber that had once been used to hold political prisoners. It was cold down here, damp, the stones weeping with moisture that never dried. He had ordered the silver chains prepared himself, knowing that they would suppress her wolf and prevent her from sensing the full force of the bond. He needed her afraid but controlled. He needed time to explain, to make her understand why this had to happen. The silver would give him that time. When the guards carried her in, unconscious from the sedative they had used, something cracked inside Kael's chest. She looked so small, so fragile. Her dark hair spilled across the guard's arm like spilled ink, and her face was peaceful in sleep, unmarked by the terror she had shown in the clearing. "Chain her," he ordered, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Then leave us." They obeyed without question. In minutes, she was secured to the wall, her arms stretched above her head, her feet barely touching the floor. The silver glinted cruelly in the torchlight. Kael dismissed the guards and stood alone with his fated mate. He waited. Time passed, perhaps an hour, perhaps more. He did not move. He simply watched her breathe, studied the delicate features of her face, memorized every detail of the woman the moon goddess had chosen for him. When she finally stirred, when her eyes fluttered open and confusion gave way to awareness, when she saw where she was and began to struggle against the chains, Kael felt the bond surge within him. Even suppressed by the silver, even diminished and muted, it reached for her with desperate intensity. She screamed when she saw him, a raw, primal sound of terror that echoed off the stone walls and struck him like a physical blow. He did not approach. He stood perfectly still, allowing her to exhaust herself against the chains, waiting for the moment when she would realize that struggle was futile. It came sooner than he expected. She was stronger than she looked, this little Omega. Her screams faded to gasps, her struggles to trembling stillness, but her eyes never left his face. "What do you want?" Her voice was hoarse from screaming, but there was steel beneath the fear. "Why have you brought me here?" Kael stepped forward, moving slowly so as not to startle her further. He stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough to see the wild pulse beating at her throat. "You know why," he said simply. "You felt it too that night in the clearing, the bond, the connection. You cannot pretend otherwise." "I felt nothing but fear. You are a monster who attacked me in the dark." "I did not attack you. I caught you when you fell." "And then what? You would have let me go? A beast that large, that powerful, catching a defenseless Omega in the middle of the night?" He could not argue with her logic. From her perspective, he had been every nightmare come to life. The fact that he had released her, that he had fought his instincts to let her run, meant nothing against the terror of that initial contact. "I am Kael Valdros," he said, watching her face for recognition, "king of the Lycan realm." Her eyes widened. The fear did not diminish, but something else joined it. Understanding, perhaps, or at least the beginning of understanding. "And you," he continued, "are a Lara of the Thornwood Pack, an Omega healer with gifts beyond the ordinary. You are also, according to the bond that neither of us chose, my fated mate." She shook her head in denial, but the motion was weak. "There is no such thing. Fated mates are stories told to children, fairy tales." I believed the same. For 35 years, I rejected the very concept. I watched my mother die because of a fated bond. I swore I would never follow that path. He moved closer, close enough now to feel the faint warmth emanating from her skin, despite the chill of the dungeon. 3 months ago, something began to change inside me. A restlessness I could not explain, a need that no duty could calm. My advisors searched the ancient texts and found descriptions of exactly what I was experiencing. The call of a fated mate, the bond reaching out across distance and time, demanding to be acknowledged. "I do not want this." Her voice cracked on the words. "I have a family, a pack, a life. You cannot simply take me from everything I know." "Your pack believes you are dead." He delivered the news flatly, knowing there was no kind way to say it. "I sent word that you perished in an accident. They will mourn you and move on." The color drained from her face. For a moment, he thought she might faint. Then the rage came, hot and brilliant, burning through her terror like fire through dry grass. "You had no right. They are my family. My mother, my father, my friends. How dare you take that from me?" "I dare because I must." Kael's voice hardened. "I am king of the most powerful Lycan nation in existence. If the bond destroys me, as it will if left unfulfilled, my kingdom falls. My brother is not ready to rule. Our enemies will strike. Thousands will die in the chaos that follows." He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "One woman's happiness against the lives of thousands. Would you have me choose differently?" She stared at him, her breath coming in short gasps. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she did not look away. "You speak of thousands," she whispered, "but you did not give me a choice. You decided my fate without asking what I wanted. That is not kingship, that is tyranny." The words struck home harder than any blow. Kael stepped back, her accusation ringing in his ears. Tyrant, monster, kidnapper. He was all of these things now. In pursuing the bond that promised to save him, he had become exactly what he had always feared, a man controlled by forces beyond his reason, making decisions that destroyed innocent lives. But it was too late to turn back. The bond was real. The consequences of ignoring it were clear. And Alara, whether she wanted it or not, was now part of his world. I will not claim you against your will, he said finally. The bond requires acceptance from both parties to be fully sealed. I will not force that upon you. Then let me go. That I cannot do. He turned away, unable to bear the accusation in her eyes any longer. You will be given comfortable quarters, food, clothing, whatever you need. You will be treated with respect befitting my intended queen, but you will not leave this castle. A gilded cage is still a cage. Yes. He paused in the door to the cell, his hand resting on the cold iron. Yes, it is. He ordered her released from the silver chains and moved to the quarters he had prepared. He did not see her carried out, could not watch the guards handle her like a piece of property being relocated. Instead, he climbed to the highest tower of the castle and stood beneath the stars, letting the cold wind wash over him. He had found his fated mate. He had brought her to his castle, and in doing so, he had lost something far more precious than he had gained. Kael Valdros, king of the Lycan realm, had sacrificed his soul on the altar of necessity, and as he watched the moon rise over his kingdom, he wondered if any bond, fated or otherwise, was worth the price he had already paid. The crown had never felt heavier upon his head. The news of Draven's return reached Kael before dawn. A rider had arrived at the castle gates in the dark hours of the morning, his horse lathered and exhausted from the relentless pace. The beast's flanks heaved with each labored breath, steam rising from its coat in the cold mountain air. The messenger himself looked barely better, his face drawn and pale beneath a layer of road dust. He had ridden through the night without rest, driven by the urgency of his tidings. The message was brief, but carried the weight of a coming storm. General Kael Valdros, commander of the northern border forces, had abandoned his post and was riding south with a contingent of his most loyal warriors. He would arrive before nightfall. Kael received the news in his private chambers, where he had spent another sleepless night staring at the flames dancing in the hearth. The fire had burned down to embers now, casting the room in shades of red and shadow. He sat in a chair that had belonged to his father, its leather worn smooth by generations of Valdros kings who had wrestled with their own impossible decisions in this very spot. He did not ask why his brother was coming. He already knew. Word traveled fast in the Lycan realm. The king's mysterious guest, held in comfortable chambers on the eastern wing, the beautiful Omega who had appeared without explanation and was now being treated as something between a prisoner and a queen. Servants talked, guards whispered, and Draven, despite his distance from the capital, had always maintained his own network of informants within the castle walls. He knows, Kael thought, he knows about the fated mate. The prospect of facing his brother filled him with a weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Their relationship had been complicated for 15 years, ever since the night their mother died, and their world shattered into pieces that neither of them had ever been able to fully reassemble. Draven had been 17 when they found Seraphina's body, old enough to understand what he was seeing, young enough for the trauma to carve permanent wounds into his soul. Kael remembered every detail of that morning with terrible clarity. The way the light had fallen through the bedchamber windows, golden and peaceful, as if the day itself did not know that everything had changed. The scent of the jasmine oil their mother had always worn, still lingering in the air. The perfect stillness of her face, unmarked by pain or struggle, beautiful even in death. Draven had stood in that doorway, frozen, unable to move or speak. His hands had trembled at his sides. His breath had come in short, sharp gasps that sounded almost like sobs. He had been a boy on the cusp of manhood, tall and strong and full of promise. In that single moment, watching his mother's lifeless form, something vital had died inside him as well. Kael had dealt with the aftermath, summoning healers who could do nothing, informing their grieving father, who had still been recovering from the assassination attempt that had started this entire tragedy. Managing the crisis while his own heart crumbled to ash inside his chest. Someone had to be strong. Someone had to hold the kingdom together while it threatened to tear itself apart. At 20 years old, Kael had taken that burden upon himself because there was no one else. In the days that followed, something had broken between them. Draven retreated into a shell of anger and grief that hardened over the years into something cold and sharp. He blamed the fated bond for their mother's death. He blamed their father for being too weak to survive the loss. And somewhere beneath all of that, Kael suspected, Draven blamed him for not saving her. The brothers had not spoken of that night in 15 years. They communicated through formal channels, through military reports and official correspondence. When they were forced to share the same space at court functions, they maintained the fiction of fraternal respect while avoiding any conversation that might touch upon the wound that still festered between them. Now Draven was coming home, and Kael knew that the fiction could no longer be maintained. A knock at his chamber door interrupted his brooding. It was not the sharp, confident rap of a guard or advisor. It was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Enter," Kael called. The door opened to reveal Helena Ironwood, the castle's head of household staff. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely from a face that had once been beautiful and was now merely striking. She had served the Valdros family for 3 decades, first as a lady's maid to Queen Seraphina, then as a housekeeper after the Queen's death. There was something different about her this morning. Her usual composure seemed cracked, her hands clasped tightly before her as if to stop them from trembling. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I must speak with you. It is a matter of grave importance." Kael gestured for her to enter and close the door. "What troubles you, Helena?" She did not move from her position near the doorway. Her eyes, when they met his, held a torment that seemed to age her another decade. "I have kept a secret for 15 years, Your Majesty, a secret that has eaten at my soul every day since your mother died. I thought I was protecting the family by remaining silent. But now, with this new woman in the castle, with the fated bond returned to these halls, I fear that silence may cause even greater harm." Kael straightened in his chair, every instinct alert. "What secret?" Helena's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced down her weathered cheek. "Your mother did not die of a broken heart, Your Majesty. She did not die because the fated bond was too strong for her to bear. She was murdered." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and final as a blade. "Explain," Kael commanded, his voice suddenly cold as winter stone. Helena moved further into the room, her steps unsteady. She lowered herself into a chair without asking permission, as if her legs would no longer support her weight. "That night, the night of the assassination attempt on your father, I was attending to the Queen. She was frightened, of course, we all were, but she was also strong. She believed your father would survive. The healers had said his wounds were serious but not fatal. She was preparing to go to his bedside when a servant arrived with a goblet of wine." Helena's voice trembled. "The servant said it was from the royal physician to calm her nerves. I thought nothing of it at the time. The Queen drank it gratefully. Within an hour, she was dead." Kael felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. "Who was the servant?" "A man named Garrett. He had only been in the castle's employ for a few months. I tried to find him afterward to question him about the wine, but he had vanished, gone as if he had never existed. And the next day, they found his body in the river. Drowned, they said. An accident." "Why did you not come forward with this information?" "I was afraid, Your Majesty." Helena's voice broke. "I was a servant alone, accusing unknown forces of murdering the Queen. Who would believe me? And the chaos that followed, your father's grief, your coronation, the kingdom's instability, there was never a right moment. I told myself that justice was impossible, that speaking would only cause more pain. For 15 years you have let us believe our mother died because of the bond." "Yes." The word was barely audible. "And I am sorry, but there is more. I have been thinking about that night, about the servant, about who could have arranged such a thing, and I believe I know who was responsible." Kael leaned forward. "Who?" "The wine came from the royal stores. Only a few people had access to those stores at the time. One of them was Lord Aldrich Ravencrest." The name sent ice through Kael's veins. Aldrich, the lord who had questioned his judgment in council. The lord who had been positioning himself for greater influence since before Kael had even taken the throne. "You are certain?" "I am certain of nothing, Your Majesty. But Aldrich had access. He had motive, if he believed the fated bond made your father weak. And the servant Garrett, before he vanished, before he died, I saw him speaking with Lord Aldrich in the gardens. At the time I thought nothing of it. Now, She did not need to finish the sentence. Kael rose from his chair and moved to the window, his mind racing. If Helena was right, if his mother had been murdered by one of his own lords, then everything he had believed for 15 years was a lie. The fated bond had not killed her. A man had killed her. A man who might still walk the halls of his castle, might still sit at his council table, might still be plotting against him even now.
"You will speak of this to no one," he said, his voice hard. "Not until I have had time to investigate. If Aldrich is responsible, I will need proof before I can act."
"Yes, Your Majesty." "And Helena," he turned to face her, "why are you telling me this now, after 15 years of silence?" She met his gaze, and he saw the weight of her guilt reflected in her eyes. "Because you have brought another woman into this castle, Your Majesty, another fated mate, and I fear that history may repeat itself. If there are those who killed your mother to prevent the bond from taking root, they may try to do the same to her." The words struck home with brutal force. Elara, vulnerable, alone, hated by those who saw her as a weakness. If there truly was a faction within his court willing to murder a queen to preserve their vision of strength, she was in terrible danger. "Thank you for your honesty," Kael said, though the words felt inadequate. "However late it comes, you have given me much to consider." Helena rose and made her way to the door. She paused with her hand on the latch. "Your mother loved you, Your Majesty, both of you. She would not have wanted her sons to spend their lives blaming each other, blaming the bond, blaming forces beyond their control. Perhaps with the truth, you can finally find peace." Then she was gone, leaving Kael alone with revelations that shattered everything he thought he knew. He summoned General Theron and Lord Marcus to his chambers as the sun rose over the mountains. Both men arrived promptly, their faces showing the strain of being roused from their beds at such an early hour. Kael informed them of Draven's return, but he did not share Helena's revelations. Not yet. He needed time to process, to plan, to determine how to proceed with the investigation without alerting Aldrich to his suspicions. Marcus absorbed the news of Draven's arrival with his characteristic calm. "Your brother has strong opinions regarding the fated bond. His reaction to this development was always going to be challenging." "Challenging," Kael repeated flatly. An interesting choice of words for what promises to be a confrontation of epic proportions. "Perhaps it need not be a confrontation at all," Marcus suggested. "Draven is passionate, but he is not unreasonable. If you speak with him privately before he has a chance to stir up the council, you might be able to defuse the situation." Theron shook his head. "With respect, Lord Marcus, you do not know Draven as I do. I trained that boy from the time he could hold a sword. He was always fire where Kael was ice. When he commits to a course of action, he does not deviate, and I fear he committed to a position on this matter many years ago." The old general turned to his king. "What are your orders?" Kael considered for a moment. "Allow him to enter the castle. Station additional guards near the eastern wing, but keep them out of sight. I will not have Elara caught in the crossfire if things go badly." "And the council? They will hear of this regardless. Better to control the narrative than to let rumors run wild. Summon them for an emergency session this afternoon. I will address the matter directly before Draven has a chance to spin his own version of events." Both men bowed and departed to carry out their assignments. Kael remained alone, watching the morning light slowly fill his chambers. He had not seen Elara since their confrontation in the dungeon 3 days ago. He had ordered her moved to comfortable quarters, had ensured she received the finest food and clothing, had instructed the servants to attend to her every need, but he had not visited her himself. He told himself it was to give her time to adjust, to allow the initial shock to fade before attempting any further conversation. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. He could not bear to see the fear and hatred in her eyes again, could not stomach being called a tyrant by the woman his soul had chosen. The bond pulled at him constantly, a gravitational force that demanded proximity to its other half. Every moment away from her was a struggle against instincts that grew stronger by the hour. But Kael had spent his entire life mastering his impulses. He would not be ruled by them now. Still, he found his thoughts drifting to her throughout the morning. What was she doing in her gilded prison? Was she eating, sleeping, recovering from the trauma of her abduction? Did she spend her hours plotting escape, or had she begun to accept the reality of her situation? And beneath all of these questions, one that he tried desperately to suppress, did she feel the bond as strongly as he did? The council session was a disaster. Kael had hoped to present the situation in measured, rational terms, to explain the necessity of his actions and the potential consequences of the fated bond without allowing the discussion to devolve into emotional accusations. He had rehearsed his words carefully, anticipating objections and preparing responses. He had believed, perhaps naively, that reason would prevail. He had underestimated the depth of feeling among his lords. More importantly, he had underestimated how many of them had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The great council chamber was filled to capacity. Lords from every province had gathered, some having traveled through the night when word reached them of the emergency session. They sat at the long, curved table that faced the king's throne, their faces masks of carefully controlled ambition or concern. Behind them, lesser nobles and advisors lined the walls, silent witnesses to what everyone understood would be a pivotal moment in the kingdom's history. Lord Aldrich Ravencrest spoke first, as Kael had known he would. The man occupied the seat nearest to the king's right hand, a position that spoke to his political power rather than his loyalty. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver temples, and a face that might have been handsome if not for the constant calculation behind his eyes. His voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man who had spent his entire life maneuvering through the treacherous waters of court politics. Kael watched him with new eyes now. Was this the man who had murdered his mother? Was this calm, cultured lord capable of such treachery? "Your Majesty," Aldrich began, his voice dripping with false concern, "we are all deeply troubled by these recent developments. The appearance of this Omega, the secrecy surrounding her presence here, the whispers of a fated bond. These matters touch upon the very stability of the realm." "The realm's stability is my constant concern," Kael replied evenly, "which is precisely why I have brought this matter before the council. And yet you did not consult us before taking action. You brought this woman to the castle without informing your advisors. You deceived her pack into believing she was dead. These are not the actions of a king who trusts his council." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled lords. Kael felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. The situation required immediate action. The fated bond, once identified, creates an urgent imperative that cannot be delayed by committee deliberation. Ah, yes, the fated bond. Aldrich's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. A convenient justification for what might otherwise be called kidnapping. "Tell me, Your Majesty, how can we be certain that this bond even exists? We have only your word for it." "Are you calling your king a liar?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Aldrich hesitated, clearly recognizing that he had pushed too far. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I merely suggest that independent verification might reassure those who harbor concerns. The bond is real." The voice came from Lord Marcus, who rose to his feet with the dignity of his 60 years. "I have spent the past week researching the ancient texts. The symptoms His Majesty described are consistent with every documented case of fated mate recognition. The restless feeling that persists for months, the growing agitation, the overwhelming certainty upon first contact. These are not things that can be faked or imagined." "But they can be mistaken," another lord interjected. "The histories also speak of false bonds, of connections that seem genuine but prove to be something else entirely." "That is true," Marcus acknowledged, "which is why the bond requires mutual acceptance to be fully sealed. The king has not claimed this woman against her will. He has simply brought her here to explore the connection and determine its true nature." "And if she rejects him?" Aldrich pressed. "What then? Do we release her to spread tales of how she was abducted by the Lycan king? Do we silence her permanently? Either option carries significant risks." The discussion continued for another hour, growing more heated as the afternoon wore on. Kael listened to the arguments and counter-arguments, the political posturing and genuine concerns, the thinly veiled power plays and earnest attempts at problem-solving. Lord Ashford, ever the pragmatist, suggested that they wait and observe. Perhaps the bond would fade on its own if given time. Perhaps the woman could be persuaded to accept her situation willingly, which would quiet much of the criticism. Another lord, whose name Kael could not immediately recall, proposed a more ruthless solution. If the woman was the source of the problem, then removing the woman would remove the problem. The suggestion was met with uncomfortable silence from some quarters and barely concealed approval from others. Kael felt his beast stir dangerously at the implication. The idea of anyone harming Alara sent a surge of protective rage through his blood that he struggled to contain. "The woman is under my protection," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Any attempt to harm her will be treated as an attack on the crown itself. Is that understood?" The lord who had made the suggestion paled and quickly nodded his agreement. The message was clear. Whatever debates might occur about policy and politics, Alara herself was untouchable. Through it all, he watched Aldrich. Every gesture, every expression, every carefully chosen word. If Helena was right, this man had orchestrated the death of a queen. He had let two princes grow up believing their mother had been killed by love itself. He had poisoned the relationship between two brothers for his own political gain. And now he sat in the council chamber, questioning Kael's judgment, undermining his authority, possibly plotting another murder. The council session ended without resolution. Kael dismissed the lords with a vague promise to keep them informed of developments, knowing that the political maneuvering had only just begun. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, a horn sounded from the castle gates. Draven had arrived. Kael met his brother in the great hall, surrounded by guards and servants who maintained a careful distance from the two most powerful men in the realm. Torches lined the walls, their flames casting dancing shadows across the ancient stone. The hall had witnessed 1,000 years of Valdros history, from coronations to funerals, from declarations of war to treaties of peace. Tonight, it would witness something far more personal. Draven strode through the massive iron doors, his traveling cloak still dusted with snow from the mountain passes. He moved with the coiled grace of a predator, each step purposeful and economical. His dark hair was longer now, pulled back from a face that might have been carved from granite. At 32 years old, Draven was in his physical peak, his body honed by years of combat along the northern frontier. But it was his eyes that struck Kael most forcefully. They were their mother's eyes, gray as storm clouds rolling over the mountains, and they burned with an intensity that bordered on something dangerous. "Brother." Draven stopped 10 paces away, making no move to offer the traditional greeting between royals. "I hear you have taken a mate." The words dripped with contempt. Around them, guards and servants shifted nervously, sensing the tension that crackled between the two princes like lightning before a storm. "I have found my fated mate," Kael corrected. "The claiming has not yet occurred." "A distinction without a difference. You have brought her here. You hold her prisoner. You plan to bind yourself to her regardless of the consequences." "The consequences of not binding are far worse," Draven laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It echoed off the stone walls of the great hall, harsh and bitter, filled with 15 years of festering resentment. "Worse than what happened to our mother? Worse than watching our father wither away in grief until he was barely a shadow of the king he once was? Tell me, brother, what consequences could possibly be worse than that?" The assembled witnesses held their breath. This was not merely a disagreement between brothers. This was the eruption of a wound that had been poisoning both men for longer than some of the servants had been alive. "My own death." Kael kept his voice level, refusing to match his brother's escalating emotion. "The ancient texts are clear. A fated bond that remains unfulfilled will eventually destroy the one who resists it. Madness first, then death." "And you believe these texts? You trust words written by men dead for centuries over the evidence of your own eyes?" "I believe what I have felt for months, the restlessness that nothing can calm, the growing certainty that something vital was missing from my life." Kael took a step forward, lowering his voice. "I fought this, Draven. I tried to deny it, to suppress it, to find another way. There is none." For a moment, something flickered in Draven's eyes, something that might have been understanding, or perhaps recognition, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath layers of anger and grief. "I was 17 years old when I found her body. Did you know that? I was the first one to enter the room. I saw her lying there so peaceful, like she was just sleeping, and I thought for one terrible moment that everything would be fine, that she would open her eyes and smile at me and tell me it was all just a bad dream." His voice cracked. "But she did not open her eyes. She never opened them again. And when the healers came, when they examined her and pronounced her dead, do you know what they said? They said her heart had given out. They said the bond with father was so strong that when he was wounded, when she thought she might lose him, the grief was too much. The bond killed her, Kael. It reached into her chest and stopped her heart." Kael closed his eyes, the memories flooding back unbidden. He had been about to share what Helena had told him, to shatter the lie they had both lived with for 15 years. But he held back. Not yet. Not until he had proof. Not until he could offer Draven justice, along with truth. "I know," he said quietly. "I was there too, Draven. I held her hand while it grew cold. I made the arrangements for her funeral while Father lay unconscious in the healer's chambers. I carried the weight of this kingdom on my shoulders while still barely a man myself, because there was no one else to carry it." "Then how can you repeat her mistake? How can you willingly bind yourself to another person, knowing what that bond can do?" "Because the alternative is worse." Kael opened his eyes, meeting his brother's tortured gaze. "If I resist the bond, I die. If I die, you become king before you are ready. If you become king in chaos, our enemies will strike. The Northern Realm has been waiting for a sign of weakness for decades. King Fenris would march his armies across our borders before my body was cold." "Let him try. I am not afraid of Fenris." "It is not about fear. It is about thousands of lives that would be lost in a war that could be prevented." The silence stretched between them, thick with 15 years of unspoken grief and resentment. Before either of them could speak again, the doors to the great hall burst open. A messenger stumbled in, his face pale with exhaustion and something else. Fear. "Your Majesty," he gasped, falling to his knees. "Urgent news from the northern border. King Fenris has made a proclamation." Kael felt a chill run down his spine. "What proclamation?" The messenger swallowed hard. "He claims to have a fated bond, with an omega matching the description of the woman you brought to the castle. He demands that she be handed over to him as his rightful mate." The words hung in the air like poison. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Draven let out a harsh laugh. "It seems destiny has a sense of humor after all. 2 kings, 1 woman. Tell me, brother, how does your precious bond feel about competition?" Kael did not answer. His mind was racing, processing the implications of this news. A counterclaim to a fated bond was almost unheard of. The bond was supposed to be absolute, written in the stars by the moon goddess herself, for 2 different alphas to both claim the same omega. "Summon Lord Marcus," he commanded, "and clear the hall. This matter requires private discussion." As the servants and guards hurried to obey, Kael caught Draven's arm. "Stay. Whatever our differences, you need to hear what comes next." Draven hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "For the kingdom, not for you. I will take what I can get." Marcus arrived within the hour, his arms laden with ancient texts that he spread across a table in Kael's private study. The books were crumbling with age, their pages yellowed and fragile, filled with script and languages that had not been spoken for centuries. Marcus handled them with the reverence of a priest handling holy relics, carefully turning each page to avoid further damage to the precious manuscripts. The 3 men gathered around as the old scholar began to explain. A single candle provided light, its flame steady in the still air of the study. Shadows danced on the walls as Marcus traced his finger along the faded text, translating the ancient words into something they could understand. "It is called a twin bond," Marcus said, his weathered finger pointing to a passage in one of the manuscripts. "Extremely rare. There are only 4 documented cases in the past 1,000 years, and the records of even those are fragmentary at best." "How is it possible?" Kael demanded. "The bond is supposed to be singular, 1 alpha for 1 omega." "In most cases, yes, but the twin bond occurs when the moon goddess faces an impossible choice. 2 alphas of nearly equal power, nearly equal worthiness, both capable of being the perfect match for a particular omega. She cannot decide between them, and so she creates a connection with both." "So Fenris truly has a bond with Alara?" "Possibly. The texts are unclear on whether both bonds are equally real, or whether one is true and the other merely an echo." Marcus turned to another page. "What is clear is that the situation cannot remain unresolved. The twin bond creates instability. Both alphas will feel the pull. Both will be driven to claim. And if neither backs down—" "War," Draven finished flatly. "A war over a woman." "It would not be just about her," Marcus corrected. "The twin bond has always been resolved through conflict. Not necessarily military conflict, but competition of some kind. The texts speak of trials, of challenges designed to determine which alpha is truly worthy." "And if I simply claim Alara now before Fenris can act?" Marcus hesitated. "The texts suggest that would cause the false bond to backlash.
The alpha who holds the false connection would experience severe consequences, potentially fatal consequences. So we need to determine which bond is real, Draven said slowly, before any claiming occurs. How? Kael asked. Marcus closed the manuscripts with a heavy sigh. There is only one certain way, the mating mark. When the true bond is sealed, the false one will dissolve harmlessly. But if the wrong pair is marked— He did not need to finish. The implications were clear. Kael turned to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Somewhere in this castle, Elara sat in her chambers, unaware of the storm brewing around her. I need to speak with her, he said finally. She deserves to know what is happening. The walk to Elara's chambers felt longer than it should have. The castle corridors were quiet, most of the servants having retired to their quarters. Guards stood at their posts in silence, acknowledging their king with crisp nods as he passed. The eastern wing had been prepared specifically for Elara. The chambers were spacious and elegant, decorated with tapestries depicting peaceful scenes of forests and moonlit meadows. Every comfort had been provided, every luxury made available. But they were still chambers in a castle that served as her prison. He paused with his hand on the door, gathering himself. Then he pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was warm, lit by a fire crackling in the hearth, and dozens of candles arranged on every surface. Elara stood by the window, her back to him, her slender form silhouetted against the fading twilight. She was wearing a dress of deep blue silk that caught the candlelight like liquid midnight. She did not turn when he entered. I wondered when you would come. Her voice was different than he remembered, calmer, more controlled. How are you being treated? Like a queen, or a prized horse. I am not certain which. She finally turned to face him. The servants are attentive. The food is excellent. My cage is very comfortable. I did not come to argue about your accommodations. Then why did you come? Kael moved further into the room, maintaining a careful distance. There has been a development, something you need to know. He told her about King Fenris, about the counterclaim, about the twin bond and its implications. He watched her face as she absorbed the information, saw the confusion give way to disbelief, then to something that looked almost like dark amusement. So now there are two kings fighting over me, like dogs over a bone. That is not how I would describe it. How would you describe it then? Two powerful men, each claiming ownership of a woman who wants nothing to do with either of them. What would you call that if not a fight over property? Kael had no answer that would satisfy her. The truth was uncomfortable. From her perspective, she was indeed being treated as an object, a prize to be won, rather than a person with her own desires and choices. I understand how it must seem to you, he said finally. And I wish I could tell you that your autonomy matters more than politics and power, but the reality is more complicated than that. It always is with kings. They talked for hours, their conversation ranging from the political implications of the twin bond to their own complicated feelings about the connection between them. Slowly, grudgingly, the wall of hostility between them began to crack. Helena told me about your mother, Elara said eventually, about what happened to her. Kael stiffened. What did she tell you? That she died of a broken heart, that the fated bond was so strong that she could not survive the threat of losing her mate. Elara studied his face. Is that what you are afraid of? That the bond will destroy me the way it destroyed her? Kael thought of Helena's revelations, of the murder that had been disguised as heartbreak. He wanted to tell Elara the truth, but something held him back. Not yet, not until he was certain. I am afraid of many things, he admitted instead. I am afraid of losing control. I am afraid of becoming like my father. I am afraid of what will happen if I let myself feel everything the bond is offering. Elara reached out and placed her hand on his chest, directly over his heart. The contact was electric. The bond roared to life, flooding both of them with warmth and connection. This is real, she whispered. Whatever else is happening, this is real. Yes. I'm still angry at you, for what you did, for how you did it. You have every right to be. But I do not want to be the cause of a war. If there is a way to resolve this without bloodshed, I am willing to try. It was more than Kael had dared to hope for. Not acceptance of the bond, not forgiveness for his actions, but a willingness to engage. Tomorrow, he said, I will bring you to the council. You will hear everything, participate in everything, and together we will find a way through this. Kael moved toward the door, then paused. There is something else you should know, about my mother, about how she truly died. Elara looked at him with sudden intensity. What do you mean?
Helena came to me this morning with information she has kept hidden for 15 years. Information that changes everything we believed about that night. He took a deep breath. My mother was not killed by the bond, she was murdered. The revelation hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Ilara's face showed shock, confusion, a dozen questions fighting to be voiced. But before she could speak, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Shouting voices, running footsteps, the clash of steel on steel. Kael's hand went to his sword as the door burst open. General Theron stood there, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. Your Majesty, we are under attack. Someone has breached the castle walls. The time for revelations was over. The time for battle had begun. Kael turned to Ilara, his face set in hard lines. Stay here, bar the door. Do not open it for anyone except me. Then he was gone, racing toward the sounds of combat, toward the defense of his kingdom and his people. Behind him, the bond stretched and pulled, calling him back to his mate. But duty came first. It always had. He only hoped that when this night was over, there would still be a kingdom worth ruling, and a mate worth fighting for. The attack came from within. Kael raced through the corridors of his castle, his sword drawn, his senses expanded to their fullest extent. The sounds of combat echoed from multiple directions, steel clashing against steel, the roars of men and beasts locked in mortal struggle. Smoke drifted through the hallways, acrid and thick, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of blood. General Theron ran beside him, despite the wound on his forehead that continued to seep crimson down the side of his face. The old warrior had refused treatment, insisted on accompanying his king into whatever danger awaited. 55 years of service had not diminished his loyalty or his courage. How many? Kael demanded as they rounded a corner. Unknown. They came through the servant passages. At least 24, possibly more. They wear no colors, carry no banners. Assassins, not soldiers. Assassins. The word sent ice through Kael's veins. This was not an invasion. This was a targeted strike, designed to remove specific individuals rather than capture territory. And in a castle full of potential targets, there was only one that truly mattered. Ilara. He had left her alone, unguarded, told her to bar the door and wait for him, as if a wooden door could stop determined killers. The bond screamed at him to turn back, to abandon everything else and race to her side. But the sounds of combat were coming from the direction of the Great Hall, where the bulk of his guards would be stationed. If he did not rally his forces, if he did not organize the defense, the entire castle could fall. Duty warred with instinct, king warred with mate. Theron, Kael's voice was steady despite the turmoil within. Take a squad to the eastern wing. Protect the woman there with your life. My place is beside you. Your place is where I command it to be. She is more important than you know, more important than me. Theron hesitated for only a moment. Then he nodded, understanding dawning in his weathered eyes. It will be done. The general peeled away, shouting orders to nearby soldiers as he disappeared into the smoky corridors. Kael continued toward the Great Hall, where the sounds of battle had reached a crescendo. He burst through the doors to find chaos. The Great Hall had become a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay scattered across the stone floor, some wearing the colors of his household guard, others dressed in the black of professional killers. At the center of the melee, a group of assassins had formed a protective ring around a figure that Kael recognized immediately. Lord Aldrich Ravencrest stood calmly amid the violence, his fine clothes unstained by the blood that pooled around his feet. He was watching the battle with an expression of clinical detachment. Their eyes met across the chaos. Aldrich smiled. "Your Majesty," he called out, his voice somehow carrying over the din of combat. "How good of you to join us. I had hoped to present you with a cleaner situation, but it seems your guards are more persistent than anticipated." Kael did not waste breath on words. He launched himself into the fray, his sword cutting a path through the assassins who tried to block his advance. The beast within him surged to the surface, lending speed and strength beyond what any normal man could possess. Bodies fell before him. Men who had trained their entire lives in the arts of death found themselves outmatched by a predator whose bloodline stretched back to the dawn of their race. Kael felt no satisfaction in the killing, only grim necessity. He reached Aldrich in less than a minute. The Lord had not moved, had not even drawn a weapon. "Impressive," Aldrich said. "Your father would be proud." "My father would have had you executed years ago for the treachery I can smell on you." "Perhaps, but your father is dead, and soon so will you be."
The attack came from behind. Kael sensed it a heartbeat before it landed, spinning to deflect a blade that would have taken his head from his shoulders. 3 more assassins had approached while he was focused on Aldrich. Kael fought them off, but more kept coming. He was being overwhelmed through sheer numbers. A blade sliced across his arm. Another found his thigh. Through the haze of combat, he saw Aldrich begin to move toward the door. The Lord was going to escape. Kael summoned every reserve of strength he possessed. The transformation began, bones cracking and reshaping, muscles expanding, skin giving way to fur. In moments, the man was gone. In his place stood the Lycan, 8 feet of primal fury. The assassins faltered, their confidence evaporating. Kael roared, and the sound shook the very foundations of the castle. Then he attacked. The battle was over in minutes. Those who did not flee were torn apart, but Aldrich was gone, slipped away during the chaos. Kael forced himself back into human form. He turned to the nearest guard. "Find Lord Aldrich. Search every room, every passage, every shadow. I want him brought before me alive." "Yes, Your Majesty." "And send word about General Theron. I need a report on the eastern wing." The guard hesitated. "General Theron, Your Majesty. He fell defending the woman's chambers. The healers are with him now." The words hit Kael like a physical blow. Theron, the man who had taught him everything about combat and honor. How badly? "Grievous wounds, Your Majesty, but he lives, for now." Kael pushed through the carnage toward the eastern wing, his heart heavy with dread. He found Alara's chambers surrounded by bodies. The door had been battered down. Inside, the furniture was overturned, candles scattered across the floor. Alara sat in the corner of the room, her knees drawn to her chest. She was covered in blood. "Alara." She flinched at the sound of his voice, then seemed to recognize him. "They came for me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 of them. They said they were going to take me to someone who would appreciate me properly. "King Fenris." "I think so." She looked down at her blood-covered hands. There was so much blood. But it was not mine. I do not understand how it happened. Kael understood. The bond, even incomplete, carried certain protections. When the Omega was threatened, when the Alpha was unable to protect directly, the bond could channel strength in unexpected ways. "General Theron," he said gently, "he came to protect you." "The old warrior." "Yes, he fought like a demon until they cut him down. I thought he was dead." She shook her head. And then one of the assassins said something. About Lord Aldrich, about how he had planned this for years, how he had been waiting for the right moment to strike. "What else did he say?" "That this was not the first time Aldrich had moved against your family, that there was something from before, something about your mother." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Helena's revelation, the murdered queen. Aldrich had orchestrated it all. "I have to find him," Kael said. "Wait." Alara caught his hand. "Do not do this alone. Whatever happened with your mother, you need allies. I cannot ask others to risk themselves for my vengeance." "It is not just vengeance. It is justice." Her grip tightened. "And for me, he sent those men to take me. I want to see him answer for that." Kael looked at this woman who fate had chosen for him. She was stronger than he had given her credit for. "Together, then. We will end this together." The search for Aldrich lasted 3 days. The castle was turned inside out, every hidden passage explored, every secret room uncovered. Lord Marcus coordinated the investigation while Kael oversaw the kingdom's security, and Draven, who had remained after the attack, led hunting parties through the surrounding mountains. The brothers worked side by side for the first time in years, their old rivalry set aside in the face of a common enemy. They did not speak much at first, the years of silence and resentment creating a barrier that neither knew how to breach. But on the second day, as they stood together on a mountain overlook, watching their search parties comb the valleys below, Draven broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Kael turned to look at his brother, surprised. "For what?" "For 15 years of anger directed at the wrong target. I blamed you for not saving Mother. I blamed the bond for killing her. I blamed everyone except the one who was actually responsible. You did not know. Neither did you. But you did not let it poison your entire life the way I did." Draven's gray eyes, so like their mother's, were filled with a pain that ran deeper than words. "I was so consumed by hatred that I forgot how to be your brother." Kael was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and clasped Draven's shoulder, the first physical contact they had shared since their mother's funeral. "We both lost her. We both suffered. The fact that we suffered in different ways does not make either of our pain less real. But I made your pain worse. I abandoned you when you needed me most. You were 17 years old, Draven. You were a child dealing with trauma that would have broken most grown men. I never blamed you for retreating. I only wished I could have retreated with you. Draven looked at him with something like wonder. All these years I thought you hated me. I thought the same of you. A bitter laugh escaped Draven's lips. What fools we have been. Two brothers, tearing themselves apart over a lie, while the true enemy walked among us unpunished. Then let us be fools no longer. Kael met his brother's gaze with fierce determination. When we find Aldrich, we will face him together, as brothers, as the sons of Seraphina Valdros, and we will make him answer for what he has done. Draven's hand came up to clasp Kael's arm, mirroring the gesture. Together. It was not forgiveness, it was not reconciliation, but it was a beginning. General Theron survived his wounds, though the healers said he would never fight again. Kael visited him daily, sitting by his bedside and updating him on the progress of the search. On the third day, one of Draven's scouts reported movement in an abandoned watchtower on the eastern ridge. The description of the leader matched Aldrich perfectly. Kael assembled his forces personally, 50 of his best warriors. Draven would lead the assault while Kael handled the capture. The watchtower assault was swift and brutal. Aldrich's remaining supporters were overwhelmed within minutes. When the dust settled, only Aldrich himself remained, cornered in the highest chamber with nowhere left to run. Kael found him standing by the window, looking out over the kingdom he had tried to steal. 15 years, Aldrich said without turning. 15 years of planning, and it all falls apart because of a bond I did not anticipate. You killed my mother. Now Aldrich turned. The mask of the loyal lord had fallen away, revealing the cold ambition beneath. I removed an obstacle. Seraphina was making your father weak. The fated bond had turned him from a conquering king into a lovesick fool. So you poisoned her. You used Moonsbane, stolen from the royal treasury, and you murdered the queen. I did what was necessary. Kael's hand tightened on his sword. You planned to use the bond against me as well. You leaked information about Alara to King Fenris, hoping to create a conflict that would weaken me. Fenris was always going to be a problem. I simply accelerated the timeline. Aldrich smiled thinly. You have to admit, it was an elegant plan. It was the plan of a coward and a traitor, and it ends now. The trial took place in the Great Hall, now cleaned of blood and filled with every lord and lady who could be summoned. Aldrich stood in chains before the obsidian throne, his fine clothes replaced with the rough garb of a prisoner. Helena testified about what she had witnessed 15 years ago. Lord Marcus presented evidence gathered from Aldrich's private chambers. Servants who had been paid to look the other way came forward with their confessions. When all the evidence had been presented, Kael rose from his throne to deliver judgment. Lord Aldrich Ravencrest, you have been found guilty of high treason, regicide, conspiracy to commit murder, and countless other crimes against the crown. The sentence is death. A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles. However, Kael continued, death would be a mercy you do not deserve. Instead, you will be stripped of your titles, your lands, your wealth. Everything you have worked for will be taken from you. You will be branded as an oathbreaker and cast out from Lycan society. No pack will accept you. No lord will shelter you. You will wander the wilds as a lone wolf until exposure or starvation claims what remains of your worthless life. The color drained from Aldrich's face. For a man who had defined himself by status and power, this fate was far worse than a quick execution. Do you have anything to say before sentence is carried out? You think you have won, but you have only delayed the inevitable. The Northern Realm will still come for you, and when your kingdom burns, remember that I tried to prevent it. Kael gestured to the guards. Take him away. After the guards had dragged Aldrich from the hall, the crowd began to disperse, but Kael remained on his throne, and Draven remained standing beside him. When the hall was finally empty except for the two of them, Draven spoke. It is done, justice for Mother at last. Is it enough? Kael asked. Does knowing the truth make the past 15 years any less painful? Draven considered this question carefully. No, the pain remains. But at least now it has a proper target. And at least now we can begin to heal. He turned to face his brother directly. I have been thinking about what you said on the mountain, about both of us suffering in different ways. I think I finally understand what you meant. Oh? You carried the kingdom, the crown, the responsibility for everyone and everything. You had no choice but to be strong, to suppress your grief, to become the king father could no longer be. Draven's voice was rough with emotion. I had the luxury of falling apart, of retreating into anger and blame. I never once considered what it must have cost you to hold everything together while your own heart was breaking. Kael was silent for a long moment. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged what he had sacrificed in those dark days after Seraphina's death. I did what had to be done, he said finally. It is what kings do. But you did not have to do it alone. You should not have had to do it alone. Draven reached out and gripped Kael's shoulder. I cannot change the past, but I can promise you this. Whatever comes next, you will not face it without me. I am your brother, and I will stand beside you, as I should have done from the beginning. Kael felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of grief and loneliness that had been tied so long he had forgotten it was there. And I will stand beside you, he replied, as I should have done instead of letting you push me away. The brothers embraced for the first time in 15 years. It was brief and awkward, two men unaccustomed to physical affection, but it was real, and it was the beginning of something both of them had thought lost forever. In the days that followed, Kael and Alara grew closer. She moved from her chambers in the eastern wing to rooms adjacent to his own. They took meals together, walked the castle gardens in the evening light, talked for hours about everything and nothing. Draven, too, became a regular presence. The brothers began training together in the mornings, relearning each other's fighting styles, rebuilding the partnership they had once shared as young men. The message from King Fenris arrived on a morning that had seemed almost peaceful. The message was brief and brutal. King Fenris rejected the legitimacy of any bond between Kael and Alara. He demanded that she be surrendered to him within 30 days. Failure to comply would be considered an act of war. The Northern Realm was mobilizing. 50,000 warriors were already marching south. War had come at last. The days that followed were consumed by preparation. Kael summoned his banners, calling every fighting man and woman to the defense of the realm. Messengers rode out to every corner of the kingdom, carrying the royal seal and the call to arms. Lords who had been rivals for generations set aside their petty disputes and pledged their forces to the crown. Draven took command of the army, his strategic brilliance finally given full scope. He had spent 15 years on the northern border, studying the enemy, learning their tactics, understanding their weaknesses. Now that knowledge would be put to its ultimate test. Lord Marcus coordinated supplies and logistics, transforming the castle into a hub of military preparation. Wagons laden with weapons and armor streamed through the gates. Blacksmiths worked through the night, their forges glowing red in the darkness. Healers gathered their supplies and prepared for the casualties that would inevitably follow. Alara refused to be sidelined. She worked alongside the healers, using her gifts to treat the injured soldiers who arrived from border skirmishes. Her ability to heal was remarkable, far beyond what any ordinary Omega possessed. Word spread quickly through the camp, and soon soldiers were seeking her out, drawn by the hope that her touch might save them from their wounds. She also attended war councils, sitting at Kael's side as his commanders debated strategy and tactics. At first, the lords had been skeptical of her presence. What could an Omega know of warfare? But Alara had a sharp mind and a keen eye for detail. More than once, she noticed flaws in proposed plans that the experienced warriors had overlooked. The supply lines through the eastern pass are vulnerable, she observed during one late-night session. If Fenris sends a raiding party through the mountains, he could cut off our reinforcements. The commanders had exchanged surprised glances, then bent over the maps to examine her concern. She had been right. The pass was poorly defended, and Fenris was exactly the kind of leader who would exploit such a weakness. Kael felt a surge of pride watching her command the room's attention. This was not the frightened woman he had pulled from the dungeon weeks ago. This was a queen in the making. On the night before the army was to march, Kael found her in the castle gardens, standing beneath an ancient oak. "You should be resting," he said. "I could say the same to you." She turned to face him, and the moonlight caught her features in a way that made his breath catch. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the bond, about us." "And?" "I was so angry when you first brought me here, terrified and furious. But these past weeks—" She paused. "I have seen who you truly are, the burden you carry, the man beneath the crown. That man is not so different from the king. He is different enough." She stepped closer.
I do not know if I can ever fully forgive the way this began, but I know that I do not want it to end. Not now. Not with a war coming that could take you from me." Kael reached out and cupped her face in his hands. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "know that you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. You have given me hope I thought I had lost forever." "Then fight," she whispered. "Fight and win and come back to me." She rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his. The bond flared, bright and overwhelming, and the kiss deepened into something that transcended mere physical contact. When they finally parted, both of them were trembling. "The mating mark," Elara said. "If you place it now, before the battle, the bond will be complete." "I know. It could help you. The completed bond grants strength that neither of us can access alone." "I know that too." Kael stroked her cheek. "But I will not mark you out of tactical necessity. When we complete the bond, it will be because we both choose it freely. And if you do not return, then at least you will be free. An incomplete bond can fade with time." Elara's eyes glistened with tears. "You are a fool, Kael Valdros." "Perhaps, but I am a fool who loves you." The words escaped before he could stop them, but once spoken, he found he did not want to take them back. "I love you too," she said. "God has helped me, but I do." They stood together beneath the ancient oak until dawn began to color the eastern sky. The army of Valdros marched at sunrise. 20,000 strong, they moved through the mountain passes toward the northern border. Kael rode at their head, his armor gleaming in the morning light. The obsidian and silver plate had been crafted by the finest smiths in the realm, enchanted by the old ways to turn aside blades and arrows alike. Beside him rode Draven, wearing the battle gear of their father, armor that had seen 100 conflicts and emerged victorious from each one. Behind them stretched a column of warriors that seemed to have no end. Infantry in disciplined ranks, their spears glinting in the sun. Cavalry on powerful war horses, eager for the charge. Archers with bows of yew and ash, their quivers full of death. And at the rear, the supply wagons and healer carts that would tend to the wounded when the fighting was done. They sang as they marched, the old battle hymns that had been passed down through generations of Lycan warriors, songs of glory and sacrifice, of victory and honor. The sound echoed off the mountain walls, a promise and a threat to any who might oppose them. The Northern Realm's forces met them on the plains of Ashenmoor, a vast expanse of frozen ground that had seen countless battles over the centuries. King Fenris had brought his full strength, 50,000 warriors arrayed in disciplined ranks that stretched from horizon to horizon. It should have been a hopeless fight. The numbers were against them, more than 2-1. The enemy held the higher ground and had the advantage of fighting on territory they knew well. But Kael was not fighting for territory or glory. He was fighting for his people, for his brother, for the woman who had chosen to stand beside him despite everything. The battle raged from dawn until dusk. The two armies crashed together with a sound like thunder, steel meeting steel, claw meeting claw, as warriors on both sides transformed into their beast forms. The frozen ground turned to mud, churned by thousands of feet, then to red slush as blood mingled with the earth. Kael lost count of how many enemies fell before his sword, how many times he was wounded and kept fighting. His armor was dented and scarred, his sword arm burned with exhaustion, but still he pressed forward. Beside him, Draven fought with equal ferocity, the brothers protecting each other's flanks as they had done in the training yards of their youth. As the sun began to set, painting the bloody field in shades of red and gold, King Fenris rode forward to challenge him directly. "End this," Fenris called out. "Single combat, you and me. The winner takes everything." It was an old tradition, one that had fallen out of favor in recent centuries, a king's duel, with kingdoms as the stakes. Kael's advisors would have told him to refuse, to continue the conventional battle, to avoid risking everything on a single contest. But Kael was tired of playing it safe, tired of making the cautious choice. "I accept." A murmur ran through both armies. Warriors lowered their weapons and stepped back, creating a circle in the center of the blood-soaked field. For this moment, at least, the war was suspended. Everything depended on what happened next. They met in the center of the field, surrounded by the silent witnesses of both armies. Fenris was formidable, younger than Kael by several years. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural warrior, his sword seeming to be an extension of his arm rather than a separate weapon. He fought with the desperate energy of a man who believed he was fighting for his fated mate. Every strike carried the weight of conviction, the certainty that the moon goddess was on his side. But the bond Fenris claimed was false. Kael could feel the truth of it now, could sense the emptiness where a real connection should have been. Whatever the Northern King believed, whatever he felt, it was an echo rather than a true calling. The duel lasted less than 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. They circled each other at first, testing defenses, probing for weaknesses. Fenris was fast, faster than Kael had expected, and his technique was flawless. If this had been a contest of pure skill, the outcome might have been different. But Kael had something Fenris did not. He had the true bond, incomplete but real, feeding him strength and determination that transcended mere physical ability. He fought not just for victory, but for Alara, for Draven, for the kingdom and the future they would build together. When Fenris overextended on a thrust, Kael was ready. He deflected the blade and spun inside the Northern King's guard, his sword sweeping up in an arc that knocked Fenris's weapon from his hand. A kick to the chest sent him sprawling onto the frozen ground. When it was over, Fenris lay on the frozen ground, his sword broken, Kael's blade at his throat. "Do it," Fenris said. "Finish it." Kael hesitated. He could end it here, remove the threat permanently. But he had promised himself that he would not be that kind of king. "No," he said, lowering his sword. "You will return to your kingdom and sign a treaty that ends this conflict forever. You will acknowledge that the bond you claimed was false and that Alara is mine by right of the true connection." Fenris stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You are either the bravest king I have ever met or the most foolish. Perhaps both." The treaty was signed that night. The Northern Realm withdrew its forces. Peace, fragile but real, had been achieved. Kael rode home a hero. The weeks that followed were a time of rebuilding and renewal. The kingdom recovered from the strains of war, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as normalcy returned. Trade resumed along the northern roads, merchants who had fled during the conflict returning with their wares. Farmers who had taken up arms returned to their fields to prepare for the spring planting. Families reunited as soldiers returned to their homes, weary but victorious. The castle itself was transformed. What had been a place of tension and fear became something warmer, more welcoming. Servants who had walked on eggshells around their troubled king found themselves relaxing as the atmosphere changed. Laughter was heard in corridors that had known only whispered urgency for years. For Kael and Alara, it was a time of deepening connection. Without the shadow of war hanging over them, without the constant pressure of political crisis, they were finally able to explore what the bond truly meant. Not as a force that controlled them, but as a gift they could choose to embrace. They spent long evenings together, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Kael told her about the weight of the crown, the loneliness that had defined his reign until she appeared. Alara spoke of her life in the Thornwood Pack, the family she still mourned, the dreams she had once held for a simpler future. Draven became a regular presence at their table. The brothers had begun the slow work of rebuilding their relationship, learning to be family again after so many years of distance. Some evenings they would train together in the practice yards. Others they would simply sit and talk, filling in the gaps that 15 years of silence had created. General Theron recovered enough to leave the healer's chambers, though he walked with a cane now and could no longer hold a sword. Kael appointed him to a new position as Master of the Royal Guard, a role that allowed him to share his decades of experience with the next generation of warriors. Lord Marcus continued his scholarly pursuits, now with a particular focus on the history of the fated bond. He had become fascinated by the phenomenon of the twin bond and was determined to ensure that future generations would have better guidance than the fragmentary texts that currently existed. And through it all, the bond between Kael and Alara grew stronger. Not the desperate, overwhelming pull of those first chaotic days, but something deeper and more stable, a connection built on understanding and choice as much as destiny. The coronation of Queen Alara took place on the first day of spring. The great hall was filled to capacity with lords and ladies from every corner of the realm. The obsidian throne had been joined by a second seat, carved from moonstone and silver. Alara stood at the entrance to the hall, dressed in a gown of deepest blue, a crown of silver and sapphires resting upon her brow. She had changed in the months since Kael had first brought her to this place. The frightened Omega was gone, replaced by a woman of strength and grace. Kael waited on the dais, watching her approach. Beside him stood Draven, serving as witness for the royal family. The ceremony was ancient, the words spoken in the old tongue, but the meaning was clear. Two souls, bound by fate and choice, joined together before the eyes of gods and men. When it was time for the mating mark, the hall fell silent. Kael took Alara's hand and led her to the center of the dais, where moonlight streamed through a specially designed window. He looked into her eyes, seeing there the love and trust that had grown between them. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He lowered his head to her throat, to the sacred place where the mark would be placed. His lips brushed her skin, and she shivered. Then his teeth sank in, gentle but firm, and the bond completed. The sensation was beyond description. It was like being whole for the first time, like finding a piece of himself he had not known was missing. He felt her emotions flood into him, her love and her joy and her fierce determination. And somewhere far to the north, in the cold halls of the northern realm, King Fenris felt something shatter inside his chest. The false bond, the echo that had convinced him Alara was his, dissolved like morning frost in sunlight. For a moment there was pain, sharp and disorienting. Then there was nothing but emptiness where the connection had once been. He would learn in time that this was a mercy. The dissolution of a false bond was painless compared to what would have happened if he had tried to mark Alara himself. The ancient texts were clear on this point, though Fenris would never read them. The false claimant who attempted to seal an illegitimate bond faced madness and death. The moon goddess, it seemed, had her own ways of protecting her chosen ones. In the great hall of Valdros, Kael lifted his head from Alara's throat. She was smiling through tears. "My queen," he said, loud enough for the hall to hear. "My king," she replied. The cheers that followed shook the castle to its foundations. Later that night, when the celebrations had finally wound down and they were alone in their chambers, Kael stood at the window and looked out over his kingdom. Alara came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The future. Everything we have built, everything we still need to build." "Are you worried?" "A king is always worried, but for the first time in 15 years, I am also hopeful." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Your mother would be proud of you." The words struck deep, but they did not wound as they once would have. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had been joined by something else: acceptance, peace. "I like to think she would be proud of both of us," Kael said. "Of the kingdom we are building, of the family we will create." Alara looked up at him, her eyes bright with something that might have been mischief. "Speaking of family," she took his hand and placed it on her stomach, and Kael felt the bond pulse with new meaning. A third presence, small but unmistakable. "How long have you known?" "The healers confirmed it this morning. I wanted to wait until tonight to tell you." Kael swept her into his arms, holding her close, feeling the miracle of new life cradled between them. An heir, a child, a future. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier now than they ever had before. "I love you too, both of you." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Kael reluctantly released Alara and called for the visitor to enter. Draven stepped into the room, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and warmth. "Forgive the intrusion. I wanted to offer my congratulations to the Queen before retiring for the night." He paused, noticing the way Kael's hand still rested on Alara's stomach. A slow smile spread across his face. "And perhaps more congratulations are in order than I realized." "You will be an uncle," Kael said, unable to keep the joy from his voice. Draven's smile widened. "Then the Valdros line continues. Mother would be pleased." He crossed the room and, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable just months ago, embraced his brother. Then he turned to Alara and took her hands in his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for bringing my brother back to me." Alara squeezed his hands. "Thank you for giving him a reason to hope again." After Draven departed, Kael and Alara returned to the window. They stood together watching the moon rise over the kingdom they would protect, the legacy they would build, the family they would raise. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges and dangers, triumphs and setbacks, but they would face them all together. For they were bound by something stronger than duty, stronger than fate, stronger even than the crown that had once weighed so heavily upon a lonely king. They were bound by love, and that was the greatest power of all. End of Part 3. The End.